Hey everyone, Dan Saavedra here from MergeYourData, and today I'm going to be going over why revenue data needs to be inside of HubSpot. It's a topic that comes up a lot during our discovery with clients, and it is a critical topic to get right. I'm going to go into exactly why you would want to tie your real revenue data back to HubSpot, some of the challenges around it, some of the results that we see from doing that. And so let's get into it. If you want the link to this Miro board, it will be in the description of the video. You can click on that link. You can get access to this board with all the assets that we've gone through in our past videos. We also have our client growth screenshots from working with us. You can see some of the evidence of these methodologies and how they can impact your overall revenue. Obviously, when we're talking about actual realized revenue inside of HubSpot, this is a big part of it, right? Because these would be incorrect if we didn't have actual realized revenue inside of HubSpot. It could just be a complete figment of the imagination of the sales data. So we want to make sure to avoid that. Before we jump into it, I want to clarify this specifically is relevant for our clients. 5 to 20 million in revenue is typically what we work with. It can be relevant for those outside of that revenue range. But when we're talking about these things in these videos, we're talking about primarily B2B sales motions, 5 to 20 million in revenue for the companies that we work with. And so that's just a caveat. If you are outside those bounds, there will be differences, right? So when we work with companies outside those bounds, we keep other things in mind. But for this video, 5 to 20 million B2B primarily. And so this is the relevant box here that we'll be going over. I know it's a lot of text, so a lot of the good information is going to be how I'm discussing this rather than the visuals. In this one, unfortunately, we do have an example that kind of brings it all home down here. And so we'll get into that. But first, I'd like to start with why it matters, not the pros and cons list here, of why getting revenue data, whether it's from Stripe, QuickBooks, your ERP system, doesn't matter. Getting it into HubSpot is critical. And there are nuances to how you set this up as well. It's not like you're just syncing data from your ERP, from Stripe, over to the amount property inside of HubSpot. There are different setups depending on what you're trying to do that are required. And so there is nuance to that. Just want to keep that in mind. But why it matters. First off, any ROI reporting in HubSpot is misleading if closed won varies from revenue collected significantly. We see this a lot with agencies that we work with. You might have different engagement structures with different clients. And so that might look like total amounts over a 12-month period. And you have varying amounts that are collected month to month. You might have a cap, a maximum budget, but you might only spend, or your client might only spend half of that. There might be varying changes to contracts as you work with someone. You might have an increase in contract value. You might have a decrease in contract value in what's collected. And so all of these things impact whether or not you're reporting on ROI in HubSpot, because let's be honest, a lot of marketing and sales teams are looking at what they've closed inside of HubSpot, the amounts that are in there, and then they're analyzing that to see which channels, which funnels, everything else, different cohorts, how that's performing. And the reality is that with the variation in revenue collected compared to the closed amount, you're going to be wrong. And we'll show in the example below exactly why that is. That being said, the other thing that we see is that sometimes you have revenue collected in your financial systems that is not represented inside of HubSpot. And so that's a gap that needs to be identified as well. Why are you collecting revenue from people and not tracking it in your CRM? Doesn't make any sense. That clearly was an opportunity. Clearly those contacts and companies should exist in your CRM. So it needs to be in there. And so that's another thing that we come across and why it matters. Next, cohort analysis in HubSpot is useless if you start breaking down any types of sales data, any type of marketing data inside of HubSpot, breaking up those cohorts into whatever cohorts you want to look at. It's going to be wrong. The variation is going to be different. Unprofitable cohorts will slip under the radar because you think you're closing on large deals, but in reality, 12 months later, the revenue collected is not accurate. And so we'll get into that in the example. Next, alignment between marketing and sales, and then CS and finance, customer success and finance fails. If you do not integrate these, we see a huge gap, huge misalignment between these teams. And the reality is that your customer is experiencing your brand as a whole. And so, if your internal teams aren't aligned and connected, there's a good chance that your customers are actually experiencing some type of disconnect in their experience just because the front end of the operations isn't very well connected to the back ends. And so, this is why it matters to connect your financial data to HubSpot. And last but not least, many engagement types vary in terms of closed won amounts versus revenue collected over time. And so, especially with service related firms, your engagements can look like a wide variety of things. They could be very simple monthly retainers that are a fixed cost every single time. They could be a total budget overall that you are then invoicing against for different amounts on a monthly or quarterly basis. And so it's difficult to capture that variation inside of HubSpot if you're not syncing data from your financial system. Specifically, this comes into play when you're doing any type of analysis from historical closed won data and you're trying to understand different cohorts of your accounts, of your contacts. If you're just looking at the closed won data, then you're missing out on a big portion of what's actually happening. There very well can be the case, and we've seen it before, where you're closing these really big deals up front with certain industries, certain types of ICPs, certain cohorts in general. And when you actually look back at the revenue that's collected, there's a 20, 30% variation in what you closed versus what you collected. This can be positive or negative. But if you're basing all of your efforts on the marketing and sales side around specific closed won deal data that's not matching the reality of what your firm is experiencing, what your company is experiencing in terms of revenue collected, then you're missing out on a huge piece of the puzzle. You might be overquoting or underquoting. You might have difficult clients who are just a pain to collect money from. All of these things can be surfaced if you are capturing your financial data inside of HubSpot. Once again, there's different ways to do it, different ways to keep it simplified, but those are the reasons why it matters. So if you have a BI team and an external data infrastructure to join HubSpot data with your financial system data, all this can be ignored. We talked about the $5 to $20 million range. Most of those companies do not have dedicated BI teams who can join data sources somewhere else and create the analysis that are being looked at. If you do, that's great. And then all this can pretty much be ignored unless there's specific use cases you're looking for inside of HubSpot. But otherwise, you can just join the data on the outside, get all the types of analysis and accurate viewpoints that we're talking about here. If I scroll down and view this table here, let me zoom in a little bit. What we can see here is a table with different deals, and I'll delete this one because we don't need this. Different deals in different industries, 2 in manufacturing, 2 in logistics. In the CRM, we have these closed won deal amounts. We have revenue collected over here in the financial system. And you can see the differential here. And we collected that in the bottom table just because this Miro board has the limitations around the analysis. And so you can see we have 195,000 closed won for manufacturing, 90,000 for logistics. It seems like a huge difference. You might be like, let's go in on manufacturing. Let's focus all of our efforts there. But then you look at the revenue collected, and what you're actually seeing here when we roll up these deals is that the revenue collected is actually a little bit greater for logistics. And so it might not make sense to completely dedicate all of our resources to capturing more manufacturing deals. And there's tons of metrics that underlie each of these, right? If we're looking at close rates, sales cycle length, velocity, everything else, it all doesn't matter if we don't have this revenue collected in the financial system when we're looking at all of our ROI, all of our calculations, all of our sales and marketing analytics. So this is why it matters. This is why we focus on this. Pros and cons is how we'll wrap this up. And so pros, reduces silos between marketing, sales, and finance. Just having this conversation will surface so many things in your organization that are missing. Gaps in the customer experience because marketing, sales, finance, customer success have never discussed certain transition processes. And meanwhile, your customers are experiencing them, right? And so just talking about the numbers, trying to align on what everything means, helps get a wholesome picture of your entire customer journey. 2, accurate forecasting. Imagine trying to do forecasting in HubSpot with just sales data. It is wrong. Unless you are very, 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 very strict on What is captured in HubSpot is a direct reflection of what you will be collecting. Certain businesses, this might be the case. Let's say everything is connected to Stripe and Stripe already filters through HubSpot, or you're just billing through HubSpot and you have very fixed prices and discounts are all captured through HubSpot's billing. Then you don't really need the connection of the financial system, right? But otherwise, your forecasting will be wrong if there is any variation in how revenue is collected versus what is captured on the sales side. Next, truthful cohort reporting for marketing and sales. We talked about it before. Doing any cohort reporting inside of HubSpot is going to be wrong if you do not know what is happening on the back end in terms of revenue collected. Next, unified view for the go-to-market team. Makes everything easier. They're in HubSpot already. Data is accurate. Next, facilitates precision retention and expansion targeting. This is a word salad, but in reality, what it means is that because we can understand what revenue is or how revenue is collected on the back end and what that actually looks like compared to what we think it's going to look like from the sales perspective, we can accurately identify how we are expanding through an account, what retention is looking like, when these conversations come up, when we're seeing downgrades, when we're seeing upgrades, when we're seeing changes mid-contract. All that should be able to be surfaced inside of HubSpot when you connect the financial data with your CRM data. And last but not least, easier go-to-market experiment ROI. So you'll be able to tell whether your experiments are working much more accurately because you'll see how much revenue you're collecting on the back end. It'll feed back into the system a little bit better there. Cons, there are cons to this. One, it's difficult to implement internally. If you do not have expertise or experience in this, there are a lot of gotchas along the way. It's why we do this as an exercise as part of our services. This is part of why you would want to hire an external firm. It's difficult to do correctly internally. You can still do it. We've seen people do it successfully to a degree, but there are a lot of gotchas that might take a long time to resolve. So you can just shorten that time frame, avoid those in the first place. Next, requires more complex CRM setup, depending on what subscriptions you have in something like HubSpot. It could make sense to sync certain things to the deal object. It could make sense to create a custom object of actual revenue collected. It could make sense to use the standard invoices feature inside of HubSpot. There are pros and cons to each. Knowing how to set this up is a very difficult minefield to navigate. Next, risk of over-engineering. Do you need every single piece of information from your financial system in HubSpot? A lot of the times, the answer is no, because the teams are just trying to report on some very basic differentials, some very basic aggregations. And so in reality, you only need a few data points in HubSpot for it to be useful. Next, will require maintenance as teams and system usage change. Organizations change. They grow, they shrink, personnel changes, strategy changes, processes change. And so every time that changes, depending on how you've built it, you will have to have some type of tweak. And this is just nature of doing business, right? Clients that we've been working with for 3 or more years, their businesses have grown so much that things look different now. We have to rip some things out that were built, and then we have to build some new things out. It's just the nature of the business. You can't over-engineer and predict everything for the current state that you're in because you have to get to the next step before even building for it, right? There's some mitigation you can do. You can be smart about your architecture, but overall, you're going to require some type of change as the team, as the systems, as the organization grows. So hopefully you found this helpful. These are the types of conversations that we have with our clients to surface very useful data for expansion plays, at getting that 15% growth in 6 months or less with our playbooks. Once again, you can get the link to this Miro board with all of these different assets that we use with our clients. It's in the link in the video description. If you think that this would be useful for your organization, you want to rip through this and start growing fast now, book a call with our team. We'll see you on the call. Talk about what you're facing exactly, how our strategy could or could not fit into your business, and then we'll go from there. So thanks for watching. I'm Dan Saavedra from MergeYourData.